Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of NDUB lecture series, which is an initiative by the Department of English of Notre Dame University, Bangladesh. This lecture series, it aims at creating a knowledge-sharing platform for scholars and students where on every first and last Saturday of the month, veteran scholars would participate to lecture on various topics chaired by the head of the Department of English, Notre Dame University, Bangladesh, our dear Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury. Today, we have a renowned Shakespearean scholar with us, who was the former Vice Chancellor of Jatiyo Kobi Kazi Nazrul Islam University at Trishal, Mymensingh. He is none other than our Professor Dr. Mohit Alam. Our today's distinguished speaker had his post-graduation from the Lakehead University, Canada, and PhD from the Department of English, Dhaka University, under renowned Professor Dr. Sirajul Islam Chowdhury, if I'm not wrong, sir. And Professor Alam was also the chairman of the Department of English of Chittagong. Welcome, sir. Welcome on board. And today we will hear live from Professor Alam on the equivocative language of Macbeth. And it will be broadcasted on NDUB official Facebook page. And all the literary enthusiasts and audience might enjoy this talk on this art of misleading, where we all know equivocation is that gray line, a lie which is not actually told, also truth is not told either. So we all perhaps are used to this gray line. And let's hear from the veteran speaker, Professor Dr. Mohit Alam. Before hearing from our Professor Dr. Mohit Alam, I would like to invite Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury to introduce our distinguished speaker and our today's lecture series, also the upcoming plans. The floor is yours, sir.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Taseen. I should call you Taseen, actually. Shams is your surname. Yes. So thank you, Taseen. To introduce Professor Mohit Alam, I have to go back to the 1960s, actually. I know him since 1967, but that was a strange kind of knowing. I first met him at the Chittagong Public Library, and for 3 years, 68 actually, 68, 69, 70, we used to read books sitting across the table without talking to each other. I never talked to him. And after the library used to close, then there would be lectures at what was the Muslim Institute Hall of Chittagong, where the Bengali nationalism movement was on the rise. Renowned intellectuals like Professor Anisuzzaman would come over from Chittagong University and lecture on the importance of Bengali nationalism. And both Professor Mohit Alam and I, we would join those lectures, listen and go back home without talking to each other. And then my next phase of knowing him began in 1974 when I joined the English department at Chittagong University as a student of the first year in the English department. And there's the rail car that we used to take to commute to the university and come back. I used to call the rail car a dream car, wrote some poems on it also. And I remember having long conversations with Professor Mohit Alam, who was a couple of years senior to me. And then, well, he was a student of Dhaka University, but he did both his honors, BA honors and masters from Chittagong University. And he started teaching at the department. I think 2 years after he began teaching, I joined the English department as a lecturer. And that was the second phase, I would say, of our coming to know each other strongly. And this continued. And of course, it continued at an intellectual level We shared many ideas. We became close friends. So he was a colleague of mine. He was also a friend, a close friend. And he left Chittagong University before I left. I left Chittagong University when I was chair of the department after having completed 2.5 years of my tenure as the chairperson. I went on leave and came over to Dhaka when he was already teaching as the head of the department and professor of English at University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. And he invited me to join ULAB. And I agreed. I had a couple of other offers, which I did not accept. I joined ULAB as the second professor of the department. And I joined ULAB in the year 1990. And from 1990 to 1995, we worked very closely. And at that time, the English department of ULAB was not what it is now. It was at its formative stage, and Professor Alam worked very hard. And I was by his side always. Together we launched Crossings, the channel, which is so well known now. We also did many other things. We streamlined the English language teaching, the foundation English language teaching. We updated the curriculum and did many other things until he was made the Vice Chancellor of National Poet Qazi Nazrul Islam University. So this is just an introduction to him as a person, as a friend, as a colleague, not as a scholar. As a scholar, of course, he has earned name in the country as well as outside the country, not only for his scholarship in Shakespeare, but also for his translations of the major works of Shakespeare. He has translated almost all the major plays of Shakespeare from English to Bangla. He also he has worked in other areas too. He has very original work in Nazrul, Qazi Nazrul Islam. He has given lectures on Qazi Nazrul Islam in Bangladesh and outside Bangladesh. So he is a formidable scholar of Shakespeare, a translator, a first-rate translator, an academic, of course, who has been teaching for nearly 45 years, at least 43 years. If I have taught for 41, he should be 43. So he's a veteran, of course, and well known. And it's my privilege to introduce him to you. And well, I'm lucky in a way that I've invited him to a university, Notre Dame University, Bangladesh, which also doesn't need an introduction. Like many other universities need introduction. Many other private universities do many things to make themselves famous. They call it branding. NDUB is self-branded because, as you know, Notre Dame means Our Lady, and Our Lady is Mary, who is someone very holy to people of two religious communities, Christians and Muslims. And of course, in Keats's poem, La Belle Dame Sans Merci, the Dame is the lady. In English, it's pronounced American English, it's Dame, but I can't speak American English. I speak English my own way. So Notre Dame University may be new, but it knows what it is doing because of its solid background. The fathers of the Holy Cross, who have managed all these schools in the subcontinent called St. Placid's, St. Mary's, St. Joseph's, St. Gregory's in Bangladesh, St. Lawrence and other saints schools in the subcontinent are the ones who established Notre Dame College 70 years ago. And the kind of people Notre Dame College has produced. So Notre Dame University, I can ensure all of you, is grounded in such a way that it doesn't need much of an introduction. It doesn't need any further branding, you see, and I can assure you, I can promise that this university is going to be one of the best universities in the country. I can't tell you how long it will take. Maybe it will take 5 years, it could take 10 years, it may even take 20 years. It will definitely outlive me. It will outlive many of us, but it will emerge as the #1 private university in the country. So these few words, let me hand over to Professor Mohit for his lecture on the equivocative language of Macbeth. Right? So over to Professor Mohit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury, for having introduced me in such a flattering manner. I don't think I deserve, that high-spirited acclamation. And I actually feel very excited to deliver a speech on Shakespeare in this format, because it is in itself a new kind of experience for many of us to deliver a lecture online to a body of audience about whom I really don't know or we don't know. And my intimacy with Professor Sarwar, as he has said, goes over like 5 decades or even 6 decades. And I have never seen such a kind-hearted friend in my life, a man whose persistent, quest for knowledge and wisdom is matchless. And I am very happy to see him placed at a university in Bangladesh, which is trying to shape itself as one of the leading higher educational institutions in Bangladesh. So my thanks to Professor Sarwar, as well as to others, and to Notre Dame University, Bangladesh, for having given me this opportunity to share my views on Shakespeare, particularly on Macbeth, with you. Now, this paper which I am going to present today actually is an outgrowth of my recent engagement with Macbeth while I was editing it. Professor Sarwar has mentioned my translation of Shakespeare's plays, fine, but in addition to this, I also edited Shakespeare's 2 plays in English already. One is Hamlet and the other one is As You Like It. And Macbeth is going to be my 3rd venture. I have completed editing the text and the introduction is yet to be written. And while I was, busy editing this text, I had to read a vast number of articles that have been recently published, mainly in JSTOR website. Of the many articles, 2 actually had attracted my attention, 2 of them. And my presentation today will be very much based on these 2 articles, because these 2 articles have provoked my thoughts in another way, which is not really directly related to Macbeth, but which, as you know, neo-historicist scholar Professor Stephen Greenblatt says, which actually relates Macbeth to the socio-political and religious culture in which the play was composed and performed. So today my article's thrust will be mainly focusing on showing these relations between the text and the extra textual premises that can be found as relevant. The two essays that I have been dependent on are the first one is written by Frank L. Huntley. It was published in 1964, and the title of the article will tell you much about the main burden of my essay today. The title is Macbeth and the Background of Jesuitical Equivocation, which discusses the connection between the witch's predictions and the porter's use of the word equivocator with the Jesuitical order of doctrine of equivocation. That I will come to discuss in detail. And secondly, the other essay, which also inspired me very much in writing this essay, was published in 2006 by Mary Floyd Wilson. It's a wonderful essay, very long, and she discusses this thing that though Macbeth officially sometimes supposedly called or identified as a play written to please King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England, but then she says there is a sabotaging practice adopted by Shakespeare, by which Shakespeare does highlight his English biasedness. So these two aspects will be very much discussed in this essay today in an interactive manner. And the third part of my discussion, which actually is the main thrust of my essay, is to show that these equivocal expressions or prophecies or predictions made by the witches or by the apparitions somehow are owned by Macbeth in such a way that he also begins to speak equivocally. And because of that, he can become independent of the influence of the witches, number one, and number two, also of that of his wife. So by the end of the play, he becomes a man responsible for his own action. And that is how he actually conforms to the Shakespearean code of a tragic hero, which basically implies that a person must be responsible for his action. Mainly in the tragic plays, Shakespeare has worked out this. So with this little, little summing up of my essay, with your permission, Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury, I would like to present my essay. I would actually like to read it out. Initially, I thought that I would speak extempore, but the essay is so thick with facts and information that if I do deliver this lecture extempore, then I will be doing injustice to the series of information that is contained in the play. So that's why I am going to read it out with your permission, Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury, which implies that it might take a little time from your patience, and I seek your patience. Okay, can I start reading it, Professor Sarwar?
Please.
Okay. Now, equivocation, according to Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary, means a way of behaving or speaking that is not clear or definite and is intended to avoid or hide the truth. In the religious and political context of early modern England, equivocation became a major area of debate between the Reformers and the Jesuits. The Reformers were Protestant and the Jesuits belonged to that order of Catholicism which upheld the act of equivocation as permissible in a crisis where speaking or maintaining the truth was difficult. This aspect of Jesuitical equivocation, as I have said, has been treated by Huntley and by Mary Floyd Wilson. Macbeth was written by the end of 1606 at a time when the anti-Jesuit sentiment was very high, because just the year before, on 5th November 1605, the gunpowder plot was exposed. The plotters, including Guy Fawkes and others, wanted to blow up the Parliament House along with the king when a session was going on. Am I being heard clearly? Is my voice clear?
Sure.
Okay. It was soon discovered that the plotters were Jesuits, and their leader was the famous Jesuit superior, Father Henry Garnet, who was hanged for treason on 3rd May 1606. King James VI was already the King of Scotland when Elizabeth, Queen of England, died in 1603. She died heirless, and in 2 months' time of her death, her grand cousin James was invited to ascend the throne of England as James I. James united the two kingdoms, Scotland and England, into one country. And of the many things he did in his unionist spirit, one was his move to give the royal patent to the leading London playing company, Lord Chamberlain's Men, which thereby became the King's Men. The company felt much obliged to the new king, and by way of paying compliments to the new king, as many scholars speculate, the company wanted their supreme dramatist Shakespeare to write a play that would please the king. So largely, Macbeth is a gratificationary play in which Shakespeare wanted to highlight in a dramatic form James's preferences. The very fact of having a Scottish play being chosen by the foremost English dramatist of the time was in itself a pleasing fact for James. Henry and Paul insists that the play was performed at the court in July-August 1606, when James's wife, Queen Anne's brother, King Christian IV of Denmark, was paying a royal visit to England. And Paul is so persistent about this. The book he wrote in 1950 is called The Royal Play of Macbeth, suggesting that it was written to satisfy the king. A view, though not evidential, but upheld by such postmodern critics as Greenblatt, and Shakespeare included a scene in Macbeth, the Porter scene, Act 2, Scene 3, that closely resonates with the happenings of the gunpowder plot. The second important impetus provided to James by the play was the drawing of the character of Banquo, arguably in a rather positive light. Then he appears in Shakespeare's sources, Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland. The first edition came out in 1577 and the second in 1587. Scholars now think that Shakespeare was probably familiar with both these editions. Initially, it was thought that Shakespeare only knew Holinshed's 1577 edition, but it has now been changed. This Shakespeare did to please James, who claimed Banquo to be the founder of the Stuart dynasty, that is, James's very dynasty. In this regard, critic George Walton Williams raises this valid point that if Shakespeare did not have the idea of writing a play for royal contentment, he would have, by the logic of the play, made Duncan's ghost return rather than that of Banquo. I quote from Williams, "I repeat the question, why is the ghost not the ghost of Duncan? The immediate answer to this question is that the ghost is the ghost not of Duncan but of Banquo, because Banquo is James's ancestor." Unquote. The third act of pacification was a little devious, as it was both an accommodation of James's unificationist spirit and a matter of pride for Shakespeare too. As said earlier, James was keen on reconciling the two nations, and so we find Malcolm, the defeater of Macbeth, who left Scotland on the murder of his father, King Duncan, and has lived in England for 15 years since then, is being helped by the English king, Edward the Confessor, with military help for his assault on Macbeth, as Malcolm admits in the play. Gracious England hath lent us good sword and 10,000 men. Perhaps as a return for this gesture, Malcolm, after winning against Macbeth and assuming the throne, awards the Scottish nobility with an English title by which all the Thanes turn into owls. Malcolm says, "My Thanes and kinsmen henceforth be owls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honor named." But we can detect Shakespeare's pride in the fact that the Thanes of Scotland were converted into the owls following the English tradition. So that is how Shakespeare is deriving pleasure out of this kind of exploit. Our focus, however, in this paper is to highlight the Jesuit equivocal aspect and how it is being resented within the structure of the play that had to please James, but which at the same time paradoxically fertilizes the language of the play. This is another thrust of my essay. That is, while within the play's religio-political context, it is correct to resent the equivocal language of the witches. This very language, however, patterns and formats the play's central character Macbeth and the overall verbal sphere of the play. The rest of the essay is concerned with how the equivocal aspect acts as an umbrella criterion for figures of his speeches a galore, like alliteration, metaphor, conceit, simile, euphemism, oxymoron, paradox, personification, pun, irony, imagery, and symbol that abound only to dramatize what Macbeth says: nothing is but what is not. We first give attention to the Porter scene, Act 2, Scene 3, where the drunken doorkeeper speaks out a passage which perhaps indirectly refers to Father Garnet's hanging. "Knock, knock, knock. Who is there in the other devil's name? Faith, here is an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator." While this invitation to the equivocator to the Porter's wall, that is Inverness, Macbeth's palace, now metaphorized as hell, is important in fixing the play's time of composition, that Macbeth must have been written after the death of Father Garnet on 3rd May 1606. Its main significance lies in how Shakespeare builds both his central character and the setting within the ramifications of the contradictoriness of the equivocal utterances. Let us first look into Father Garnet's case. He published a manuscript in 1598 with the title The Treatise of Equivocation, in which, explaining the scope and function of truth, he elaborated that an oath, I quote from him, must be accompanied by truth, by discretion, and by justice, unquote. In short, Garnet's manuscript is a guidebook to know how and when to use equivocation in a matter of faith and life and death. Robert Parsons, a famous defender of Jesuitical equivocation, presents a hypothetical situation to clarify the relevance of equivocation when one's life is in crisis. He asks Thomas Morton, Bishop of Durham, that when a band of killers is assigned with the task of killing Queen Elizabeth, and they ask him, "Where is the Queen? We are sent to murder her." If Morton tells a lie, he offends God. If he tells the truth, he becomes accessory to the murder of his sovereign. So he must equivocate by saying, "I know not," keeping the other half unsaid to the end of telling you. In this way, Morton deceives the murderers, but God, who can read Morton's mind, will know this as true. Through this equivocation, Morton can save the life of the Queen and that of his too. In plain sense, equivocation allowed for double meanings or things that were only half said. Religious books tend to speak in terms of equivocation, as Huntley writes, necessary to an exegesis of many of Christ's sayings is our perceptions of his hidden meanings. Though the Jesuits made a clear division between equivocation and lying, the Protestants, for religious and political benefits, necessarily read the doctrine of equivocation as pure lies and thus punishable by law. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth issued an order that Englishmen following Roman Catholicism should not stay in England for more than 40 days if they wanted to escape death. In 1591, she warned people against Jesuit treason under false pretense of religion. William Warburton, an 18th century editor of Shakespeare, but an Anglican bishop, annotated the word equivocator as it appears in Macbeth just simply as a Jesuit, an order so troublesome in Queen Elizabeth's and King James I's time. But even the Catholics denounced the Jesuits at one point of time. Pope Innocent XI denounced the doctrine of equivocation in 1679. Sir Edward Coke, who administered the trial of Father Garnet, acknowledging his great learning in theology, said acrimoniously that Garnet was a doctor of Jesuits, that is, a doctor of 5 DDs. What are these 5 DDs? As dissimulation, deposing of princes, disposing of kingdoms, daunting and deterring of subjects, and destruction. This is Coke's view. Coke was very famous as a judge. Apart from the porter's incriminating reference to equivocations, the vital projection of them comes in the scene Act 1, Scene 3, when Macbeth and Banquo encounter the witches. The third witch says to Macbeth, "All hail Macbeth, that shall be king hereafter." According to Hartley, what remains unsaid is, if you are willing to commit murder. This unsaid part can also relate to the buried ambition of Macbeth to become the king. Likewise, the third witch again says to Banquo, "Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none." Hartley says the equivocal line can be completed by, if Macbeth murders Duncan and you, but not Fleance, which Macbeth will do. That is, he will murder both Duncan and Banquo, but he won't murder Fleance. He will fail to murder Fleance. Now, the witches volunteered the first meeting with Macbeth, but the second meeting is initiated by Macbeth himself, which is proof enough that Macbeth has become their victim. They do not prophesy this time, but produce apparitions who make predictions. The second apparition says to Macbeth, "Love to scorn the power of man, for none of women born shall harm Macbeth," which, as Huntley says, can be completed by not counting a Caesarean section. But Macbeth only believes what he hears, not paying attention to the possibility of a difference in meaning. Immediately after the first meeting, he subconsciously had automated the action of killing. But in this scene, he refuses to supply the unsaid possibility. And next he hears the third apparition saying, "Macbeth shall never vanquished be, until great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." This makes Macbeth happy, though yet he refuses to see through the possibility of army maneuvering that would make the Burnham Forest work, as Huntley suggests. These examples of equivocations, which show that lies can be embedded in half-uttered lines, but which Macbeth only realizes too late in life that he has been cheated by the witches all through. He says, "I pull in resolution and begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth." These examples can actualize the background where fear bred into the minds of the English monarchs, both Elizabeth and James, towards the equivocators as pure liars. For instance, Macbeth's realization here of the witch's equivocations as lying not only justifies the porters welcoming the equivocator to hell, but also comes in agreement with James's view of the evil potentialities of the witches. His book Demonology, first published in Scotland in 1597 and then got republished in England in 1603, the year he became the King of England, was written after his traumatic sea journey to the North Sea in 1590 while coming back home with his newly married wife Anne of Denmark. James later on attributed the raising of the storm to the witches, whose trial is known as the North Barwick witch trials, in which 70 people, mainly women, were burnt on the stake, being suspected as witches. And historical sources say that James himself interviewed many of the suspects. Critic Howell B. Calhoun quotes a sentence from King James's Demonology, where the king says that the witches, I quote from through Calhoun from James, ought to be put to death according to the law of God, and the civil and imperial law and municipal law of all Christian nations, unquote. Calhoun further categorizes between the Scottish witches, who he aligns with the continental witches, who he says were eviler, and the English witches, who were homely and comical. This is another point of thrust by Shakespeare, that the English witches were homely, friendly, not very harmful, and the Scottish witches were evil. Mary Floyd Wilson says with equal conviction that though Shakespeare wrote a Scottish play in gratification of King James, he did not deviate from the line of general criticism that the English leveled against the Scots. Despite efforts at unification by writers like Bacon, this did not change the fact that the more chauvinistic English writers characterized the Scots, particularly the Highlanders, as stubbornly uncivilized. Now there is again a division within the division. The plain-led Scottish, they were considered as good people, and the Highlanders were evil, cannibalistic, everything. And both the Macbeths were Highlanders. That is how James actually dissociated himself from the Macbeths and aligned himself with Banquo. That is the politics that Shakespeare is now working out on. Now here, yes. Now then, here I quote from James here. James says that the Highlanders were stubbornly uncivilized. Shakespeare, having been of the anti-Scottish view, yet was careful enough to amalgamate his criticism with that of King James too, who, being Scottish, still resented the Highlanders, Scottish, because they were, according to James, intemperate barbarians known for their detestable, godless, and possibly cannibalistic ways. And both the Macbeths were Highlanders. Now, there is another point Stephen Greenblatt has pointed out, that of all the major writers of the Renaissance England, except for Shakespeare, every other writer was put into jail for this term or that term. But Shakespeare knew the art of saving his skin. For example, here in Macbeth, he is playing to King James's preferences, but at the same time, he was cutting down the Scottish ego against his English ego. Apart from these coalitions with James, Shakespeare was also influenced by another development, which both held that the witches were elemental, that is, an inseparable part of the environment, and secondly, people living in the highlands were easily susceptible to the supernatural, which Mary Floyd Wilson identifies by borrowing a phrase from Timothy J. Race as possibility, P-A-S-S-I-B-I-L-I-T-Y, that is penetration or pervading something, which means that people were embedded in extended circles of shaping forces that included one's diet, one's family, the state, the natural environment, and the cosmological spheres. She further, that is Mary Floyd Wilson, she further suggests that the play's supernatural ecology rests on analogous conceptions of possibility and influence. She then adds that, quote, as Highlanders, the Macbeth's extreme possibility makes them especially susceptible to the elements. In defining Macbeth's possibility, she explains, despite his status as a warrior, which might suggest a resilient or hardened nature, Macbeth initially proves exceedingly possible, receptive to the witch's temptations, to Duncan's virtues, and to his wife's spirited rhetoric. The witch's permeability into weather is evident when Banquo says, the earth hath bubbles as the water has, and these are from them, whither are they vanished? To which Macbeth also expresses his wonderment by saying, into the air, and what seemed corporal melted as breath into the wind. So possibility. Possibility establishes the connection between nature and mortal beings. The witch's famous rhetoric choric line, fear is foul and foul is fear, is equivocal as it symbolically connects weather with Macbeth, a process termed as geohumoralism, which, as Mary Floyd Wilson defines, refers to that variations in topography and climate produced variations in national characteristics. That is, nature determines the characteristics of the people living in that condition. Therefore, as Macbeth makes his first appearance, his first sentence echoes that of the witches, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. On a political scale, the line attests to Macbeth's rise as king and fall as a dead butcher. Dead butcher is the phrase used by Malcolm in the last scene. And he also says that Lady Macbeth committed suicide like that. Okay. It also symbolically suggests that Macbeth, who fought in the initial battle as Bellona's bridegroom, becomes merely by a distance of a couple of scenes the king killer. I have done the deed, as he reports to Lady Macbeth. As Macbeth rides the crest of success, King Duncan awards him with the title of Cawdor. No more that tane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. Go, pronounce his present death, and with his former title, Great Macbeth. The irony here is obvious from the equivocation that persists, as what remains hidden is that Macbeth will turn out to be the same betrayer as Cawdor was. So Duncan's statement that there is no art to find the mind's construction in the face is doubly ironical, as he is again reposing his trust in the wrong man. Standing before the castle of Macbeth, Duncan announces, this castle hath a pleasant seat. And we can add the hidden part of the equivocal pattern that it will be so, as Huntley says, if Duncan were not murdered. Banquo, the other victim of the pair, joins in Duncan's eulogy by saying that the summer bird, the martlet, has built its nest in this nation, which is proof that heaven's breath spans wingly here, which again is devastatingly equivocal, as the hidden suggestion is, if he were not killed too. However, as the play progresses, the equivocal pattern, which so far has been the witch's property, now this is the main thrust of my essay, where I am saying that Macbeth owns the equivocal pattern, which was the property of the witches, internalizes it, and thereby he becomes independent of the witches. However, as the play progresses, the equivocal pattern, which so far has been the witch's property, begins to be owned by Macbeth himself, that is, by geohumorously finding affinity with the witches, he internalizes the language of equivocation in a way as if the witches were successful in permeating the pattern into him, which is possibility. Hamlet's to be or not to be dilemma is refocused in Macbeth's first soliloquy, if it were done when it is done. And the equivocal temper persists here in the hidden part, now not remaining unstated, but rather stated. That is unlike the witches now, because he internalizes the equivocal speech pattern. Macbeth does furnish the hidden part of the statement in the soliloquy. That is, the negative aspect of the killing becomes clear to him, and it does not remain unuttered, but rather uttered. The assassination could be done if it were the only single act without any consequence. He says, this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. Here, meaning the living world that has the court of law, where the even-handed justice serves the same poisoned chalice to the offender. So the equivocal pattern stems thus. Macbeth would have killed King Duncan if the judgment here had not stood in the way. When Macbeth has internalized the equivocal system, he knows both the stated part and the unstated part. This realization may pose as a reply to Braunmüller's great question that if Macbeth had taken all action being influenced by the witches and that of Lady Macbeth, then how would he be a tragic character, as he cannot own responsibility for his action? But if our argument is valid, we see that Macbeth has not only been permeated by the equivocation of the witches, but he has internalized it so much that he can own responsibility for his action, as he is filling up the unsaid or hidden part of the equivocal utterances. As much as Macbeth internalizes the pattern of equivocation, so much he is freeing himself from the witches, and by so much he is becoming an individual to be held responsible for his action. That is, from a person being constrained by influences, Macbeth becomes an individual with the freedom of the will and makes rather a questionable use of it. In the same speech, Macbeth evokes the famous image of the naked newborn babe, which is a visible figure of equivocation, as it is both figuring pity that the loss of Duncan will arouse and equivocal it will take the divine power, as Cleon Brooks suggests. I quote from Cleon Brooks, it's a famous essay. Is pity like the human and helpless babe, or powerful as the angel that drives the winds? It is both, and it is strong because of its very weakness, unquote. The naked babe will let everybody know about the murder, and in reaction, the sea of human tears will submerge the wind. So, from the earlier earthly equation between crime and punishment, the murder will somehow be exposed. Between crime and punishment, Macbeth now connects the crime with the heavenly disclosure, with such an arcane feeling that the murder will somehow be exposed. Macbeth says to his wife, if we should fail, to which Lady Macbeth elaborates her very practical plan of smearing the two guards with Duncan's blood and laying the knives on them and announce them to be the killers. Later on, Macbeth will spread the fiction that they were suborned by Duncan's two sons as they had fled the country, and then daringly confirms, who dares deceive it other, as we shall make our griefs and clamor roar upon his death. Though Lady Macbeth has earlier shown her possibility by inviting the evil powers to unsex her from the crown to the toe and turn her milk for gold, here in Act 1, Scene 7, however, she sounds unequivocal without any traces of possibility. We know the equivocal impact of her speech, though she does not know that Macbeth has already hinted at the angelic powers that might introduce certain physiognomic traits by which Macbeth himself will advertise the crime. If Macbeth has internalized the equivocal spirit, Lady Macbeth, after her initial possibility, rather gets over it after Duncan's killing and Macbeth succeeding him on the throne and remains outside the orbit of equivocation. That is why from the regicide scene, Act 2, Scene 2, the distancing between the murderer and his accomplice gets wider and wider with each scene. In 1955, when director Glenn Byamshaw produced his famous play for RSC, Royal Shakespeare Theatre, Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, they were in real life both husband and wife, but here in this scene, in the banquet scene, Laurence Olivier is looking away from Vivian Leigh, suggesting that the distance, mental distance has widened between the couple. Now, so there is no connection between committing murder and hearing a spiritual voice, but Macbeth, after killing Duncan, does hear a voice cry, "Sleep no more." Macbeth does murder sleep, which with the support of Thomas de Quincey, I will suggest that it is the awakening of his conscience, which oxymoronically expresses equivocal pattern that if somebody murders and feels bad, it means his conscience is waking up. I quote from De Quincey, "The knocking at the gate is hard, and it makes known audibly that the reaction is commenced. The human has made its reflux upon the fiendish." De Quincey's reaction in terms of this present essay is the filling up of the other part of equivocation. If a murder is committed, it will not pay. However, this distancing between the equivocally impregnated Macbeth and the unequivocal Lady Macbeth is vividly clear in the following transactions between them. Macbeth's hands are stained with Duncan's blood, and he thinks Neptune's ocean will not wash this blood clean, to which Lady Macbeth bluntly says, "A little water clears us of this deed." The same kind of reaction that she will show in the banquet scene, Act 3, Scene 4, when Macbeth is utterly horrified by the vision of Banquo's ghost and falls into an extreme paroxysm. Lady Macbeth prescribes his distraught to be the result of fear that has produced the ear-drawn dagger and that has now made Macbeth address incoherently at something which is nothing but his tool. So, for Lady Macbeth, the visionary dagger was Macbeth's mere hallucination, and Banquo's macabre ghost is merely objectified as a piece of stage prop. And her interpretation, of course, is realistically correct. But what is recognized in this expression is her simple failure to understand the trauma flesh is heir to, or the inseparability of the equivocal aspects from words and deeds. Here again we find Macbeth's internalizing process of equivocations. Lady Macbeth has failed to identify the source of Macbeth's fear, but Macbeth supplies the reason. That is, he is filling up the hidden meaning that was missed out on by Lady Macbeth. He says that murder had taken place before by the simple logic that when the brains were out, the man would die, and it was the final condition. But the equivocal procedure has taken over and changed things as dead people rise again with 20 mortal murders on their crowns and push us from our stools. So Lady Macbeth's unequivocal stool is for Macbeth, an equivocated stool that is not merely a piece of furniture, not merely a stage prop, but symbolically a terrifying sitting spot, a tool where the mortal is displaced by a supernatural ghost. At least Macbeth would think like that. This is more strange, Macbeth says, than such a murder is. That Macbeth wants to know his future is also prompted by the fact that he has internalized the pattern of equivocation and therefore must wish to have the unknown known to him. On their second meeting, the witches received their guest with a newly prepared broth. In the films, in Roman Polanski's 1971 film, and in Fassbender, where he is Macbeth in 2015 film. Both these films make Macbeth drink from this broth prepared by the witches. It's a very ugly, disgusting kind of drink, you see, and cajole him into a spirit of bonhomie. Making a slight rearrangement, the witches make predictions not by themselves, but invite their masters, in fact their subordinates, whom Macbeth, however, cannot ask any question. At the beginning of this paper, we showed how Macbeth missed out on the equivocal meaning of the prophecies, and so we need not repeat them here, but we add the fact that predictions now are made to cheat Macbeth once again, but he must still inquire to know the exact shape of his future and whether the prophecy about Banquo's children will come true. Tell me, if thou art can tell so much, shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom? For Macbeth's satisfaction, they present a show of 8 kings. The last, with a glass in his hand, is shown to him without equivocation. And finally appears Banquo's ghost. Much to his irritation, Macbeth says, "Thou crown dost sear mine eyeballs." It is a long line of kings, to the great exasperation of Macbeth. What, will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? He says. Then Macbeth understands that the witches also told the truth. Horrible sight! Now I see it's true, for the blood-boltered Banquo smiles upon me and points at them at his. In the final act of the play, Macbeth's undoing is equivalent to his losing trust in the witches. But even then, like the phase of his first meeting with the witches, the second meeting again puts a hood on his eyes. He cannot see the truth, for the illusion of lasting power is still embedded in his mind. So the prophecies that led to his murders, regicide and Banquo's killing, the second meeting again feeds him with illusion, and he goes on to kill Lady Macduff and her son. As he sees Macduff in his own castle's corridor, challenging him for a duel, Macbeth is still in a hangover and tells Macduff that he could cut the ear, thou the intransigent ear, with thy keen sword impress, or cut the sea, let fall thy blade on vulnerable crests, but would not be able to shed blood from him, as I bear a charmed life, thou wast born of woman. But to Macbeth's great horror, Macduff lets him know that he was born of a Caesarean section. Tell thee, Macduff says, tell thee, Macduff was from his mother's womb, untimely ripped. Then Macbeth comes to his full senses and produces a speech of self-realization. He says, and be these juggling fiends no more believed, that pelter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. And the very first Macbeth that we heard of in the beginning of the play, Valor's Minion, makes as if a circular movement and comes back to his old self as he says, I will not yield to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet and to be baited with the rebel's curse. And in the following line, he dispenses with the last vestiges of his illusion of the absurd. Though Barnum would be come to Dunsinane, and thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. So finally, I am just finishing now, capping. Finally, to cap our discussion, we wanted to show how Shakespeare used James's approved resentment of witchcraft tactfully, so that the witches remained uniquely a Scottish phenomenon as opposed to the harmless English witches, and Macbeth was permeated by their equivocal speeches because he belonged to the Highlands of the people of which James had a very low opinion. We also refer to the religio-political context which made the doctrine of equivocation a controversial issue, and then how it got connected with the witches, and we also showed how the witches' equivocal property got transferred to Macbeth, who in his turn internalized it so much that the internalizing process enables him to become independent of the external influences and own responsibility for his action, thus becoming a true tragic character according to the Shakespearean code, which is a character must be responsible for his action. So with this, I finish my essay. I must thank my audience for their patience, and if I happen to have tortured your patience, taxed your patience, please forgive me. Thank you.
It was wonderful to hear from you, Professor Dr. Mohitul Alam. I would request one of our faculty members, Dilip Kumar Sarkar sir, who's present with us and was patient throughout the journey. Would you please share? Now the floor is open for audience comments and feedback from the panelists or any queries. So I'd request one of the faculty members, Dilip Kumar Sarkar, to share a few words or any queries if you have with our Professor Dr. Mohitul Alam. Dilip sir, the floor is yours.
No, he has to unmute his.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Rams, for giving me the opportunity to speak a few words. And I'm very lucky to be in a lecture series, in a lecture like this. Mohit sir, for the first time, actually, I come. So, though my friend, one of my friends, Dr. Imdadul Huda, is teaching in. So he's my classmate, sir.
Oh, I see. But you look much younger than he.
Maybe. He's my classmate. We passed from Russia University in the same year. He is my best friend. Yeah. So, and I have heard your name from him, and I'm really fortunate to be in a lecture given by you, actually. So, you have, what should I say, actually? I was glued to this lecture. The thing is that you have mentioned almost all the equivocal language used by the witches, by Macbeth, by porters, by Lady Macbeth, and all these things, actually. So you were also connecting the background of Macbeth to the history. So my question, I have two questions actually here. My question is...
Ask me easy questions.
Thing is that, sir, we will learn from you, sir, if you are... Yeah. So my first question is, you are connecting Macbeth to history. It's really superb. And for the first time, I came to know this relation between history, that period, and writing Macbeth. So thing is that it is said that Macbeth is a superb example. I mean, Shakespeare has written this of Elizabethan crime, because in those days it was the practice of killing king and usurping power. So yeah. So Macbeth did the same things, though he had the greatness in his character. He was a nobleman, because during the beginning of the drama, he says, King Duncan is my cousin, he is the king, he has given me a lot of opportunity, so we will proceed no more in the business, once he said to Lady Macbeth. So he was not very willing, though he was influenced by the witches, and the second time he was influenced more by the witches, I believe, the three prediction made by the three apparition, and he was greatly influenced. But the question is, did Shakespeare willingly reflect the context of Elizabethan time and usurping power by killing the king in Macbeth? That's one question. And another question is, where lies the greatness of Macbeth in this drama Macbeth? Because throughout the whole drama, when he first met the witches, there was thunder and lightning when they were coming back from the battlefield. So both Banquo and Macbeth were reacting in a different way to the prophecy of the witches. But I believe that Macbeth had the evil character in himself from the very beginning. Evil character in him, because he reacted to the prophecy of the witches in a different way from Banquo. But it is said that if he had not met the witches and if he had not got a wife like Lady Macbeth, things have been different. What do you say, sir? Two questions.
Okay, first thing is that you refer to Macbeth saying, addressing Duncan as cousin. It is historically true. Both Macbeth and Duncan's grandfather was Malcolm III. So Malcolm III, 2 daughters, 2 sons. So they are like Khalatubhais. Okay. Macbeth and another thing is that Duncan was much younger in actual history, but in order to arouse sympathy for Duncan, Shakespeare uses his dramatic license and makes Duncan elderly. And the other thing is that Banquo wasn't in Holyshed's. Banquo was an accomplice in the conspiracy. But here, because Banquo was claimed to be James's ancestor, so therefore Banquo is created as a very clean character, and the reaction to different types of reaction to the witches happen because it is very obvious in the play that the ambition was latent in Macbeth. The ambition to become the king was latent in Macbeth because there was a possibility. There was a difference between English system of succession and the Scottish system of succession. The English royal succession was defined by the rule of primogeniture, which means the throne will always go down to the eldest son, that is eldest prince. But in Scotland, it was not like that. It was different. The king would have been chosen from the nobility, and Macbeth was very much up on the list because he was the first cousin of the king. So when Duncan announced Malcolm as Prince of Cumberland, next king, so Macbeth's latent ambition, which was already fed by the witches' predictions, it got fired up. And Banquo's logical mind was there. He did not react to the witches because he said in one of his speeches, he says, I want to keep my soul clean in this play. And it was dramatically, you have to say Shakespeare was a dramatist. So for him, the stage was the most important thing, not the history, not the narrative, historical narrative. It was secondary. For him, it was how to make it intense. So if Banquo was not produced as a contrast to Macbeth, then the drama would not have been very much appealing. And now the most difficult thing that Shakespeare tackled here, he actually tried with this experiment before with the Richard III. Richard III is both a king and a villain, but he was only half successful there. But here you see Macbeth is a villain out and out. He is a regicide. He is comparable to Claudius in Hamlet, but Macbeth is the hero. Now, what does Shakespeare do? What dramatic technique does he use to make Macbeth appear as a hero? One very simple answer to this question is Macbeth's mind, his language. Macbeth produces soliloquies. You see, after every crime, he comes to the audience and produces a soliloquy. And that soliloquy is so profound, it creates a kind of defensive wall, okay, behind which he can be protected. So this kind of defensive walls have been created by Shakespeare in order to let Macbeth emerge as the hero, though he is a condemned character because Malcolm says that he is a dead butcher. And another question is that if Macbeth is not created as a villain, James would not be very happy, because I have told you that James used to hate the Highlanders. Macbeth was from the Highland. So all this, I don't say that Shakespeare read this history thoroughly, but Shakespeare was a very perceptive dramatist. So they can always, you see, they can always perceive things by hints. So good question.
Sir, one more question is that Shakespeare has sympathized with Macbeth to defend him sometimes, and it is said sometimes, I don't know, remember the name of the critic, maybe Professor Bradley.
Bradley, yeah.
Maybe he says it was the saying that Shakespeare has purposely killed Banquo in the middle of the drama. Otherwise, Banquo would have been the hero of the play, not Macbeth.
No. Bradley didn't actually say this. Bradley said Bradley, it like
some other critic.
Okay.
Some other critic. I don't remember.
Bradley actually said that Banquo was also equally culpable because Banquo didn't do enough to resist Macbeth from doing the regicide. So you see, Bradley therefore is an exceptional critic who finds fault with Banquo too. And this one, which you say raises that Banquo should have been the hero, no. You have to understand the conception of the drama. It is Shakespeare writing a drama. When he has decided that Macbeth should be the hero, so he will invest all his creative energy so that Macbeth's heroism never diminishes. Okay, so I mean, if we look at every piece of Shakespeare from the stage point of view, then things begin to appear differently.
Yeah, well, sir, I agree with you, because once when Macbeth was planning all these things, Banquo was quiet. He didn't protest against this.
Yeah, this is what pointed out by Bradley. Now, Stephen Greenblatt also said something. I have like private correspondence with him. So I asked him why Lady Macbeth should have mentioned, that image of suckling the baby and dashing it to death if she had not ever become a mother. Historically, Lady Macbeth was actually a mother by her first husband. But in the play, there is no mention of it, that she had ever conceived by Macbeth. Then he said that actually it was a fantasy. Lady Macbeth, in order to impress her husband, acted out this fantasy that if the child was suckling my breast, I would have breast it. But I would slightly disagree with this point, because Lady Macbeth, no, it's okay. Yeah, Lady Macbeth actually probably tried to do something going beyond her latent capacities. Because you remember, she went to kill Duncan too, but she said that I could not kill him because his face resembled my father.
Father, yes.
Yeah, so that is a weakness. But Lady Macbeth is a very powerful character. Sarah Siddons, the 18th century actress, she is the first actress on the stage who tried to portray Lady Macbeth in a softer tone. But before her, other actresses, they always played the role of Lady Macbeth as if she was the fourth witch. But Sarah Siddons, Sarah Siddons started a tradition by which Lady Macbeth becomes a kind of more empathetic woman, which you find also in this movie, where this famous actress from our time, she also performs Lady Macbeth's role as a sympathetic, caring wife. Okay.
In our country, sir?
Who? No, from Hollywood. Yeah, her name I am forgetting. She is very famous. And Macbeth's poetry, you see, if you compare Macbeth's poetry, it is the crystallized. Shakespeare's best poetic genius is crystallized into the utterances Macbeth makes. Hamlet is very good. Hamlet's poetry is very sublime, but Hamlet's poetry, like, it spreads over a long horizon. But so far as the vertical penetration is concerned, it is Macbeth's poetry.
Yeah, like tomorrow and tomorrow.
Yeah, matchless. His poetry is matchless. Even when he says, it is now my time to retire and spend my life in luxury with people taking care of me, but I cannot put my head to the pillow. By becoming the king, I have lost my sleep. My mind is full of, scorpions, he says. And these lines are universal lines. Anybody is suffering from any kind of guilty conscience, he must read Macbeth in order to get rid of this, hangover.
So do you find this sort of absurdism in the sort of when he says that tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in the pretty pace to the last syllable of recorded time? So absurdism, he means to say the world has no meaning at all.
Yeah, Macbeth has lost the meaning of life. Yeah, here it is very much like that. He says that life is a tale told by an idiot, all sound and fury signifying nothing in the same speech. So here Macbeth has reached that kind of stage in his life where he has lost all meanings of life. So this utterance of frustration should be allied to Macbeth, not to Shakespeare. Many readers confuse this with Shakespeare's own saying. No, Shakespeare was very much an optimistic man in his career. Yeah. This is again Shakespeare's quality, you see. He can divide his genius in order to suit the nature of the characters. So many different characters are speaking in many different ways, but it is the same Shakespeare who is portraying every character. This is what John Keats said, negative capability. Shakespeare's skill in producing negative capability in my reading. My reading is very limited. In my reading, I have never seen any other writer as able as Shakespeare is to infiltrate into the mind of his character, keeping himself detached from it, as if Shakespeare is not there. So when the students ask me this question, sir, it is not Macbeth, it is Shakespeare who has said it. I say, no, don't make this confusion. Shakespeare is such a skilled writer that the dialogues, the speeches are to be possessed or owned by that character. Don't say that it is Shakespeare's lines. Of course it is Shakespeare's lines, but it is not Shakespeare's lines, it is Macbeth's lines.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilip sir, for this wonderful panel discussion that we had with Professor Dr. Mohit Golam and
any other
so
questions?
yes, we can take questions from the audience through comments. Who are watching us live in Facebook can comment, and before that, I would invite Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury to share a few words. Professor Golam. Sir, can you hear me? Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury. On the lecture that was just delivered by Professor Dr. Mohit Golam.
Shams, next time you can request Professor Golam Sarwar Chowdhury to buy data when such a program is going on, because you cannot depend on Wi-Fi. If I depended on Wi-Fi, then my program would have been just destroyed.
Right.
So I bought data. Data gives you the. So you might request him to do that. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for the suggestion, sir. So, Golam Sarwar, sir. We can hear you, sir. You can go on.
Do we have any other questions?
We do not have yet. People are.
No, I'm asking if
thank you, sir.
If there are any questions from the others listening. If no questions. If there are no questions, I felicitate. I thank Professor Mohit Golam for his wonderful lecture. I would say it's a groundbreaking lecture where we could discern his perspective. His vast scholarship on Shakespeare could enable him to speak along the lines he spoke, which was wonderful. And I thank you again, Professor Golam, for taking the trouble of speaking And please keep aside your the NDUB, Notre Dame University Bangladesh English Department is going to launch its own journal called Critical Insights, and we have decided to include the papers of all our guest speakers. Of course, in the inaugural issue, we will also include papers from our own colleagues such as Dilip Kumar Sarkar and the others. So please do not give away this paper to anybody. It is for the English Department NDUB's inaugural issue of Critical Insights, which we want to again establish as a leading literary journal of this country. So thank you so
What is the
much.
title of the journal? What is the title?
Critical Insights.
Okay.
Perhaps Professor Golam Chowdhury might be having a bit technical difficulty.
That is much better.
While waiting for him, let me proceed by thank you, Dr. Professor Mohitul Alam, and I especially my review would be it was really glad I was really glad to know the question that Dilip sir has asked, whether that pessimistic aspect, that dialogue that Dilip sir has referred, that nihilistic aspect, that we should not confuse that with the character, with the writer, but it's the character's verses, I would say. And Professor Golam Sarwar is back with us.
Yeah, what I said was I was thanking my colleagues, and what Professor Mohit Alam said is, unfortunately today, because our university is having its syndicate meeting, so Tasim could not get his support, and hopefully from our next lecture onwards, the IT department will be giving us full support and there won't be any problem. And in Dhaka, in most of the places, we do get uninterrupted Wi-Fi service for which we could manage it. But once again, my thanks are due to all of my colleagues, to the administration of NDUB, to Professor Mohitul Alam, who I consider as one of us. He may not be teaching at NDUB, but he's one of our well-wishers. So is Professor Syed Manzurul Islam, who is right now attending a syndicate meeting. Professor Fakhrul Alam is also one of our well-wishers. He's a student of Notre Dame College and a student of St. Joseph School. So is Professor Kaisar Hamidul Haq, who is not a student of Notre Dame College, but a student of St. Gregory's School. So they're all our well-wishers, and with their support, hopefully we will march ahead very confidently. We'll be marching slowly, but we will leave our footprints for the posterity. Thank you so much. With these words, I thank you once again and finish today's session of this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you all, and hope to see everyone tomorrow. Take care, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you. Thank you.